Also, to give us more perspective in terms of what, of course, is happening at this moment, we're being joined by Mr. Jeffrey Cabaservice, who is the Vice President of Political Studies at the Niskanen Center, and he's joining us from Virginia. Mr. Cabaservice, thank you very much indeed, sir, for taking time out and speaking to us here on WION. And let me, in fact, start off by asking you about this incident that has happened in Pennsylvania. Pennsylvania is, of course, the state which is the battlegroundest of the battleground states, the swingiest amongst the swing states. And now the Pennsylvania counties extended the voting hours due to a software glitch. Now, this is an interesting development. Do you think if incidents like this get reported, and if it is a photo finish to the end, then this can bring up concerns of some kind of a malpractice or unfair electoral vote casting and counting from either of the two camps?
I think it's very possible that the Republicans will claim that there were major software problems as well as other shenanigans if Donald Trump is judged to have lost. But the fact is that we won't actually have any results from Pennsylvania for several days. And I think that it's probably not in the best interest of either party to claim that the results are absolutely compromised by an isolated software outage in any location.
And also talking a bit more about Pennsylvania, from the year 2004, in the last 5 presidential elections, the contestant who has won Pennsylvania is the one who's gone on to win the presidential election. In your reading, who do you think has an edge in the state of Pennsylvania?
So it is interesting that Pennsylvania has been such an important and determinative state in the election outcomes. I think it's a tribute to how narrowly divided we are as a people. And Pennsylvania is one of the largest of the very few 7 or so swing states in the country. My reading is that no one knows who is going to win Pennsylvania. It is the swingiest of swing states, as you very accurately said, but it's also a very hard state to poll. And no one has realistically determined what went wrong with past polls and whether the polls are any more accurate this time around. For what it's worth, they seem to show that Pennsylvania is exactly divided. So it may come down to just a handful of voters in a handful of precincts.
You know, it's interesting that you point out that the pollsters have been wrong in the past. For people who are watching this election from outside of the United States of America, it's interesting how these pollsters have given a neck-and-neck sort of a performance by both candidates. In India, we say that these polls, the pre-poll surveys that are done, are purely for entertainment and should be taken with a lot of salt. What's it like in the United States of America? How consistent and how correct are the polls in predicting the winner?
Well, the polls do get it right sometimes, but the fact is that they, particularly in presidential elections, have failed to accurately assess Donald Trump's support. Of course, there was the terrible miss by pollsters in 2016, when nearly all of them predicted that Hillary Clinton would win walking away. But then also in 2020, their pollsters radically underestimated Donald Trump's support, and he came much closer to winning than hardly anyone had predicted. So the fact is that pollsters believe they have a trouble reaching Donald Trump supporters. Maybe Donald Trump supporters don't want to respond to pollsters or anyone else who smacks of the media or the establishment. But it also could be that as a result of this, they are overweighting Donald Trump's support and that the race might actually be more favorable to Harris than the polls would indicate. Or quite the contrary, it could be Donald Trump walking away with the victory in something like a landslide in those 7 states.
Now, talking a bit about the voter base that is voting for Donald Trump. Now, Donald Trump is not your conventional politician. He entered into politics in 2015 and he's swept the American political system in a way that no one has expected since. And also what is interesting is that his voter base continues to grow. Now, contrary to what happened in 2016, 2020, and now in 2024, a lot of people are predicting that Donald Trump could actually get a lot more black voters and also Hispanic voters, making his vote base much more diverse than what was expected. Why do you think that is happening?
So give Donald Trump credit. He was one of the very first politicians to pick up on the fact that the American political parties, the Republicans and Democrats, have essentially switched their voter bases over the last several decades. Democrats used to pride themselves on being the party of the working classes, the party of the people. But the fact is that they have an increasingly difficult time getting working class votes, not just of whites, whom they haven't won since the 90s, but increasingly of minority working class voters as well. Republicans used to be the party of the college educated. Now college educated Americans vote almost exclusively for the Democrats. But the fact is that there are a lot more American voters without college degrees than there are voters with college degrees. Voters without college degrees, which is our best proxy for the working class, are about two-thirds of Americans. So you would think that a Republican Party that can draw on a much larger voter base would be much more advantaged in these elections. But the fact also is that those typically middle-class, college-educated voters who vote Democrat are much more likely to go to the polls. So Trump is showing support in polls, particularly for African American men and Hispanic men, beyond anything we've seen for decades. But then again, those voters are also low propensity voters who may not actually turn out to vote for him on election day.
And also, you know, one of the other swing states is Arizona. Which way do you think the Arizona voters are likely to bend this time around?
Arizona has polled narrowly in support of Trump in the last several polls. I think that is the conventional wisdom, that it will go in that direction. But then again, we just don't know the answer there either. Kari Lake, who's the senatorial candidate, is actually quite unpopular and may actually end up having a negative impact on the overall ticket.
It's interesting that you mentioned that. And also to talk a bit about the black voters. You know, Kamala Harris has black heritage. She's also of Indian heritage. A lot of people would have expected that she would have had the resounding support of the black population in America. But she seems to be struggling in getting the black voters out and vote for her. Why do you think there is this perception that perhaps black men are not voting for Kamala Harris?
You know, I obviously am not from that community. I've had conversations with black men who are reluctant to support Kamala Harris. And as near as I can tell, it's because they actually feel strongly that they were raised with traditional religious beliefs and that they think that the man should actually be the one to lead and guide. And it could be that there's some reluctance among black men to support Kamala Harris on those grounds. You certainly heard Barack Obama lecture black men that they needed to do more to support Harris and black women generally. On the other hand, this is mostly anecdotal, and it's anyone's guess as to how actual black male turnout will be for either candidate.
I think that's an important point that you make here. And also, you're joining us from Virginia. You know, give us a sense of how people within Virginia are in fact looking at this election. What are the issues on which they are voting?
Well, Virginia is a very divided state, and I'm actually in Washington, D.C. at the moment. And my sense is that Northern Virginia, particularly where there are many government workers, has leaned Democratic and very solidly Democratic for a long time. But when you go further downstate into more rural areas, you see massive support for Donald Trump. There aren't enough remaining rural voters in Virginia to carry the state. It's pretty comfortably in the Democratic category. But this geographic separation is something that we are seeing increasingly across the entire country. Most counties will actually go for Trump in this election, but it's a question of whether those are declining in sparsely populated areas versus the much more populated cities and suburban areas where the real battle is being fought.
All right. Now, this is something that a lot of people would, of course, want to know. Within the United States of America, there are blue states and then there are red states. Tell us how this aligns with the urban-rural divide within the United States of America. Does the urban population in the United States vote differently from the rural population?
Well, typically urban voters vote very solidly for Democrats and rural voters vote very solidly for Republicans. The picture is a little bit different this year than in some past years, precisely because of the racial issue that you touched on earlier. Many black voters who are urban might be less likely to vote for Kamala Harris than they have been in the past. And Donald Trump seems to be doing much better among those voters than he has in the past. But it may not matter because very few of those urban areas where you see large concentrations of African Americans are likely to make a real difference outside of the swing state of Pennsylvania, where what happens in Philadelphia and Pittsburgh matters quite a lot. But if Donald Trump wins surprisingly large numbers of African American or Hispanic men in New York City, it's probably not going to make much of a difference in the overall tide of Democratic support within that state.
You know, it's also important to talk about Hispanics and the Latino voters. Speaking a little while back after he cast his vote, Donald Trump said that the biggest issue, as he sees it, is the issue of illegal immigration. A lot of the people who are targeted happen to be people who've come in from South America, making their way through Mexico into the United States when the issue of illegal immigrants is raised. But what is almost paradoxical is that the support for Donald Trump amongst the Latino community, amongst the Hispanics, seems to have gone up. What do you think explains this?
So when we speak of the Latino community, I think it's important to keep in mind that the considerable majority of Latinos in the United States were born in the United States. And in that sense, they actually are not that different from most voters who are not Latino. And one might think that immigration should be very high up on their list of concerns, but in fact, it actually comes pretty low on the list of Latino concerns, well below the economy. I think there is a sense among Donald Trump's Latino supporters, which is shared by his supporters of other races, that there's some issues where he's talking a good game, but he doesn't actually intend to follow through with his plans. So there's skepticism as to whether he would actually go so far as to round up millions of people who are here illegally, who are, as you say, people of color, most of them of Latino heritage. I think if there is actually a widespread roundup, it inevitably would sweep up people who are of Latino background but are very much American citizens. And you would then see a real shift of opinion within the Latino community. But this does seem to be an issue where most Latinos who support Trump simply don't think that they will be affected by his supposed plan to have these kind of mass roundups and internments.
That's an interesting point that you make. And also, Mr. Kamala, the issue on which the American vice president she's been talking about is how she would want to change the economy. Now, Joe Biden has said that under his presidency, the American economy has done pretty well. It has done pretty well. But the fact is, inflation has been a very big pain point for the common Americans who are trying to make ends meet. So do you think Kamala Harris is burdened with the fact that even though the American economy seems to be booming, the benefits of a booming economy are not being experienced by the common Americans in the United States, and this could be her undoing?
I absolutely think that Kamala Harris is disadvantaged by the economic performance of the country during the Biden presidency. It is true that the Biden administration did a terrific job in actually lowering the rate of inflation in the wake of the pandemic, much better than anyone had expected they would. It was the soft landing that economists almost unanimously assured us was impossible to achieve. But the fact is that prices are much higher now than they were before this pandemic-induced wave of inflation, and people feel squeezed, particularly in the working classes, where they're spending more on food as a proportion of their budget than they have in 30 years. And that further eats into Harris's already existing weaknesses with working class voters of all ethnicities and races. So it is definitely one of the issues that she has to contend with.
All right, my final question to you, Mr. Kamala, on the 25th of July, when Kamala Harris was appointed as the Democrat nominee, she came in with a bang. There was a huge bit of momentum that she generated. But in the last 15 days before the voting, do you think that momentum for Kamala Harris has actually dipped? And a lot of people are saying the reason why this has happened is because Kamala Harris seems to be pointing towards another 4 more years of Joe Biden, and not many Americans are very enthusiastic about it.
You raise a very interesting subject, which is that Joe Biden is polling below 40% in most polls of his approval rating. And most Americans also say that the country is going in the wrong direction. As many as 70% of them say that. And there's never been a president who's been elected with those kind of low ratings and that low voting. And to the extent that Kamala Harris inherits the burden of the Biden administration, you would think that there's almost no way mathematically that she could win. But the fact is that since Harris took over as the Democratic presidential nominee, she really did inspire a wave of enthusiasm and people coming back together within the Democratic camp in a way that no one had expected to happen under Joe Biden. So she really reset the table. Now, I think it's possible that she will still lose, and it certainly is not to her advantage that she has only been the nominee for a matter of months.
Right.
Really, if she loses, people will point to the fact that Biden should have got out of the race long ago and let Democrats fight it out among themselves so that they could cohere behind a nominee. But I think in terms of campaigning, Harris has done about as good a job as anyone could have been expected to do under the circumstances.
For all the latest news, download the WION app and subscribe to our YouTube channel.